Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Written by the fictional John Ray Jr., Ph.D., the foreword informs us that the author of this manuscript, entitled Lolita, or The Confession of a White Widowed Male, died of heart failure in 1952, while imprisoned and awaiting trial. He does not mention what the author was arrested for. The author's lawyer, C. Clarke, contacted Ray to edit and possibly publish the manuscript, but only after the death of the title character. Ray, who had previously edited works on abnormal psychology, makes some changes to ensure the anonymity of the characters. He states, however, that he had very little editing to do, and the book is entirely the invention and creation of the author. He feels that to change it further would not be true to the author's intent or to the richness of the subject matter. Ray states that while the story in the manuscript is entirely true, almost all names have been changed because of its sordid nature. The exception is the name Lolita, which is the title character's nickname. Her real name is Dolores, and too intertwined with the tale to be changed. Lolita's last name, however, has been changed to the pseudonym Hayes. The author had chosen his own pseudonym, Humbert Humbert. Ray notes that a diligent reader would be able to ascertain the events of the novel by researching news events in the fall of 1952. He then summarizes the fates of various characters in the novel, including the death of a Mrs. Richard Schiller. He states that he received some confirmatory details from at least one person, a Mr. Windmuller, who does not want his family to be connected with the author or his crimes in any way. Ray admits that despite its lack of four-letter words, the book may be considered very offensive by some. Nonetheless, he argues that to change the language or wording of the novel would be to dilute its essence and its sensuous detail. Ray states that he finds Humbert Humbert's actions reprehensible and his opinions ludicrous. However, he nevertheless thinks that the author manages to be very persuasive, articulate, and seemingly sincere in his love for Lolita. Given his background as an editor of psychology, Ray provides some psychological insight into the author's character. He suggests that about 12% of the adult male population may share Humbert's condition and further posits the notion that, with the help of a competent psychoanalyst, the tragedies in the novel might have been avoided. Ray believes that this manuscript will become a classic in psychiatric circles, where it will be read as a personal study of abnormal behavior. It may also prove to be a cautionary tale, encouraging parents to be vigilant in the rearing of their children. Humbert lists the many different names of his love: Dolores, Lo, Dolly, Lolita. He admits to being a murderer and states that he will present his case to the readers, whom he calls his jury. Humbert explains that Lolita was not the first girl child in his life and refers to a particular girl he calls Exhibit Number 1. Humbert begins his story from his birth in Paris and his childhood on the Riviera, where a frequently absent father and a kind, yet strict aunt raise him. His mother had died suddenly, and he describes this traumatic event with only two brief words: picnic, lightning. His father runs a luxurious hotel, and Humbert lives a healthy, happy childhood among the Riviera tourists. He states that his sexual education up until the age of 13 has been sporadic and somewhat dreamlike, based on old French novels and movies. In the summer of 1923, Humbert meets a 12-year-old girl named Annabelle Lee, who is traveling with her parents. Although Humbert and Annabelle are initially just friends, that friendship soon changes into passionate, adolescent love. Humbert states that he doesn't have as clear a picture of Annabelle as he does of Lolita, though he lyrically recounts their awkward, fumbling attempts at sex. Annabelle and Humbert never manage to consummate their love, and 4 months later she dies of typhus in Corfu. Humbert wonders if his predilection for young girls began with Annabelle and claims that she and Lolita are somehow connected. He claims that his brief encounter with Annabelle had physical and spiritual components that today's children would never understand. He mourns the fact that he was never able to complete the sexual act with Annabelle and describes one encounter in the Mimosa Grove where they came very close. He tells the reader that he was only able to break free of Annabelle's spell when he met Lolita, more than 20 years later. Humbert discusses his college days, when he gave up the study of psychiatry for the study of English literature. Moderately successful, he publishes a few books. During this time, he visits many kinds of prostitutes, but finds himself mostly drawn to a particular type of girl, the nymphette. A nymphette, according to Humbert, is a girl between the ages of 9 and 14, not necessarily beautiful, but possessing an elusive, sexually appealing quality. He attributes this quality to a magic spell and makes references to historical and cultural instances of romance and marriage between underage girls and older men. He states that the allure of the nymphette can only be understood by adult men who are at least 30 years older and who have the wisdom to understand the girl's enchanting qualities. While Humbert spends his time watching nymphets in the playground, he rarely acts on his obsession. As an attractive man, Humbert finds himself with many adult female admirers. However, most of them repulse him. Humbert finds it unfair that a man can bet a girl of 17, but not one of 12. Humbert wonders what happens to nymphets as they grow older. He describes his affair with the young prostitute Monique, which ends when Monique matures out of her nymphette phase. Humbert then encounters an aging procuress who provides him with another prostitute who, although young, isn't a nymphette in Humbert's view. When he tries to leave, the girl becomes angry. Humbert takes her upstairs and pays her, but he doesn't sleep with her. In an effort to curtail his illicit desires, Humbert decides to get married. He courts and marries a Polish doctor's daughter named Valeria. He finds the conquest rather easy, given his good looks, but states that despite his success with adult women, he considers himself hopeless in matters of sex. Humbert chooses Valeria because of her childlike nature and flirtatious, doll-like airs, and she quickly falls in love with him. Despite his initial attraction to her girlish personality, Humbert finds Valeria's intellectual inferiority distasteful, and he rarely sleeps with her. After some time, an uncle dies and leaves him an inheritance, but the will includes the condition that Humbert move to America and take some interest in the uncle's business. Valeria feels reluctant to leave Paris, though Humbert tries to convince her that she'll enjoy America. Finally, Valeria confesses to having an affair with a taxi driver. Despite his relative indifference to Valeria, Humbert feels deeply betrayed and thinks about killing her. Courteous and apologetic, the taxi driver arrives to take Valeria away. He does not leave Humbert alone with Valeria at any moment, so Humbert can't kill her. Valeria rather melodramatically packs her things and leaves. He later learns that Valeria died in childbirth in 1945, after she and her husband moved to California to participate in a bizarre psychological experiment. At this point in the story, Humbert becomes distracted by the poor state of the prison library. He names some of the books available, including the Children's Encyclopedia, which he likes for the pictures of Girl Scouts. He notes a surprising coincidence in a copy of Who's Who in the Limelight and transcribes a page for the reader. The page includes the playwright Claire Quilty, who wrote such plays as The Little Nymph and Fatherly Love. Who's Who claims that Quilty's works with children are particularly notable. The transcribed page also contains an entry on Dolores Quine, and Humbert says that seeing Lolita's given name, Dolores, still gives him a thrill. He states that his Lolita might have appeared in a play called The Murdered Playwright, and he plays word games with the names Quine and Quilty. He notes that he now has only words to play with. Humbert recounts his travels to New York, where he takes a job transcribing French literature and writing perfume ads. He watches the nymphets in Central Park and later has a breakdown due to the stress of his job. After his release from the sanitarium, Humbert takes part in an exploratory trip to the Arctic, where he is charged with studying the psychology of his teammates. The trip improves his health, but he finds the project tedious and publishes a phony analysis of the psychological issues he was supposed to be studying. Upon his return, he has another breakdown and is institutionalized once again, where he enjoys confusing the doctors with fictional symptoms. This behavior improves his mood greatly. He stays for a few months before checking out and re-entering the world. Upon his release from the sanitarium, Humbert heads for a small town to stay with a Mr. McCoo. A relative of a friend of his uncle's, McCoo has a 12-year-old daughter, whom Humbert fantasizes about. When he arrives in the town of Ramsdale, however, he learns that the McCoo's house has burned down. Mr. McCoo recommends a boarding house at 342 Lawn Street, run by the widowed Mrs. Hayes. Neither Mrs. Hayes nor the house impress Humbert. He describes her as a fatally conventional woman, one who, despite her so-called cultural and community activities, has many pretensions and little imagination. He realizes with distaste that she will probably try to seduce him. He finds the house horribly unappealing until he sees Mrs. Hayes's 12-year-old daughter, Dolores, sitting on the lawn. Humbert finds her resemblance to Annabelle uncanny and immediately remembers his time with Annabelle 25 years ago. He decides to stay. From prison, Humbert recalls passages from his diary regarding the time he lived at the Hayes house in 1947 and his initial thoughts of Lolita. Almost all his entries describe encounters with Lolita and contain romantic descriptions of her nymphet qualities, as well as his various attempts to lure her into his presence. Delighted, he learns that he resembles a celebrity Lolita adores, which causes Charlotte to tease Lolita about having a crush on Humbert. Though he knows that he should not be keeping a journal of his attraction, Humbert can't help himself. He often goes into Lolita's room and touches her things. He describes Charlotte Hayes disdainfully and hates her for always complaining about Lolita. He knows that he must behave himself with Charlotte around, so he daydreams about killing her. Charlotte, Lolita, and Humbert plan to go to Hourglass Lake for a picnic, but the trip continually gets postponed. Humbert gets a further disappointment when he learns that a classmate of Lolita's will accompany them. Humbert learns that the previous boarder, elderly Mrs. Phelan, broke her hip and had to leave suddenly, which enabled Humbert to come and live with the Hayeses. Humbert expresses amazement at how fate led him here, to his dream nymphette. One Sunday, when the trip to the lake gets postponed yet again, Lolita becomes angry and refuses to go to church with Charlotte. Delighted, Humbert has Lolita all to himself. When Lolita starts eating an apple, Humbert teasingly takes it away from her. He finally returns it and, as Lolita sings a popular song, discreetly rubs against her until he climaxes. Lolita runs off, apparently without having noticed anything. Famished, Humbert goes into town for lunch. He feels proud that he managed to satisfy himself without corrupting the child, and he wavers between wanting to repeat the experience and wanting to preserve Lolita's purity. Later, Charlotte tells Humbert that she is sending Lolita away to summer camp for 3 weeks. Humbert hides his misery by pretending to have a toothache. Mrs. Hayes recommends that he see their neighbor, Dr. Quilty, a dentist and the uncle of a playwright. Humbert considers leaving the boarding house until Lolita returns in the fall. Lolita doesn't want to go to camp, but Charlotte dismisses her tears. Humbert muses that Lolita might lose her purity while she's away and cease to be a nymphette. Just before she enters the car to go to camp, Lolita rushes back and kisses Humbert. Still reeling from Lolita's kiss, Humbert is handed a note by the maid, Louise. Charlotte Hayes has written him a letter, confessing her love for him and asking that he leave, unless he reciprocates the feeling and marries her. Humbert goes into Lolita's room and looks at the clippings on the wall. One of the men in the pictures resembles Humbert, and Lolita has written HH on it. Humbert considers marrying Charlotte so he can stay close to Lolita. He even toys with the idea of giving both mother and daughter sleeping pills in order to fondle Lolita. He would stop short, he thinks, of having sex with the girl. Humbert decides to marry Charlotte and calls the summer camp to tell her. However, Charlotte has already left, and he reaches Lolita instead. He informs her that he plans to marry her mother. Lolita seems distracted and not particularly interested. She has already forgotten about Humbert at camp. However, Humbert believes he will win her back after the wedding. He makes himself a drink and waits for Charlotte to return. Charlotte and Humbert become lovers and start planning the wedding. Charlotte quizzes him on whether he's a good Christian and says she will commit suicide if he isn't. Charlotte enjoys the prestige of being engaged to Humbert and waits on him hand and foot. Humbert states that he actually enjoys some aspects of the affair and that it seems to improve Charlotte's looks. Humbert tells himself that this helps him get as close as possible to Lolita. Charlotte responds to the engagement by becoming highly social and redecorating the house. Charlotte doesn't have very many close friends, besides John and Jean Farlow, whose niece, Rosalind, goes to school with Lolita. Humbert describes Charlotte further and mentions that she is about to suffer a bad accident. Humbert finds Charlotte extremely jealous, as she asks him to confess all his previous relationships and mistresses. Humbert makes up some stories to satisfy her romantic notions. He grows used to Charlotte, but her constant criticism of Lolita still secretly upsets him. Charlotte and Humbert go to the nearby lake in the last week of summer. Charlotte confesses that she wants to get a real maid and send Lolita off to boarding school. Humbert sees quietly, but, afraid of repeating his experience with Valeria, doesn't want to intimidate her. He considers killing her there at the lake, but cannot bring himself to do so. Jean and John Farlow join them, and Jean tells of seeing two young people embracing by the water. She starts to tell a story of Ivor Quilty's nephew, but gets interrupted. Humbert tries the silent treatment on Charlotte, to no effect. However, when she decides they will go to England in the fall, Humbert argues against it, and she immediately becomes contrite for making plans without him. Regaining some control in the relationship pleases Humbert. Charlotte tries to be near him as much as possible and mentions going to stay at a hotel called the Enchanted Hunters. She wonders why he locks the small table in his study. Humbert teases her by saying it contains love letters. Later, Humbert worries whether the table's key remains secure in its hiding place. Charlotte informs Humbert that Lolita can only begin attending boarding school in January. Meanwhile, Humbert visits a doctor and pretends to have insomnia, in order to procure stronger sleeping pills to use on Lolita and Charlotte. When he returns from the appointment, he finds that Charlotte has broken into the table in his study and found the journal in which he details his lust for Lolita. Bitterly angry, she threatens to leave with Lolita, having already written some letters. Humbert goes into the kitchen to mix a drink and decides to tell Charlotte that the journal was merely part of a novel he's working on. Just as he finishes the drink, the phone rings, and a man informs Humbert that Charlotte has been run over by a car. After receiving the phone call, Humbert races outside to discover Charlotte dead. She had tripped on the wet cement and fallen into the path of a car, which was swerving to avoid hitting a dog. Humbert quietly retrieves the letters she had been planning to mail and tears them up. The Farlows arrive, and Humbert begins drinking. That night, Humbert reads the letters, one of which is addressed to Lolita, one to a reformatory school where Charlotte planned to send Lolita, and one to Humbert himself. Later, Humbert implies to John and Jean Farlow that he and Charlotte had an affair many years ago, when he was still married to Valeria. Jean rushes to the conclusion that Humbert is Lolita's real father. Humbert asks them not to tell Lolita of her mother's death, so as not to ruin her time at camp. He tells them of his plans to take her away on a trip. The driver of the car that killed Charlotte, Mr. Frederick Beale, Jr., comes to apologize, but states that Charlotte was at fault. Humbert agrees. In private, Humbert feels guilty over not having destroyed his journal, and weeps. The next day, as Humbert leaves to get Lolita, Jean, who has become very attracted to him, kisses him passionately. Humbert muses on the coincidences that have brought him to Lolita, but doesn't allow himself to become too excited by the thought of being with her. Trying to plan how to steal Lolita away without looking suspicious, Humbert becomes plagued by doubts. He plans to take her out of the camp by claiming that her mother has fallen sick, but he can't be sure that Lolita hasn't already heard about Charlotte's death. Unfortunately, Lolita has gone on a hike and won't return for 2 days. Humbert buys Lolita many presents, including clothing, as he knows her measurements almost by heart. He also makes a reservation at a hotel called the Enchanted Hunters, which Charlotte had mentioned to him before her death. Humbert, worn down by prison life, considers abandoning his account. He writes Lolita's name out several times, and then commands the person who will eventually print his novel to keep repeating her name until the page is full. When Humbert picks up Lolita from the camp, he thinks for a moment that he might want to simply be a good father to her. That moment passes, however, and he realizes he still loves her. Humbert tells Lolita that her mother is in the hospital, and they drive off. Lolita tells Humbert that she's been unfaithful to him, but then she kisses him flirtatiously. In the midst of their kiss, a policeman stops them and asks after the whereabouts of a blue sedan, which Humbert and Lolita profess not to have seen. They arrive at the Enchanted Hunters and take room 342. Unable to get a cot for Lolita, Humbert realizes they will have to share a double bed. Lolita giggles and says that would be incest. In the room, Lolita shows Humbert how to kiss, but she soon loses interest in what they're doing. Downstairs, in the dining room, Lolita spots someone who looks like Quilty, the celebrity she admires. Back in the room, Humbert gives Lolita a sleeping pill, and she soon becomes drowsy. As she falls asleep, she tells Humbert that she has been a disgusting girl, but Humbert tells her to tell him tomorrow. Humbert locks the door and goes downstairs. Humbert eagerly anticipates caressing the unconscious Lolita. He claims that he hadn't planned on taking Lolita's innocence or purity, but merely wanted to fondle her while she slept. He admits that it should have been clear to him then that Lolita and Annabelle were not the same, and that if he had known what pain and trouble would follow, he would have done things differently. Downstairs, Humbert wanders through the hotel's public rooms. On the terrace, he encounters a man who insinuatingly accuses him of behaving inappropriately with Lolita. Each time Humbert asks the man to repeat himself, however, the man feigns innocence and pretends to make idle chit-chat about the weather. The man, who remains half hidden in the shadows, invites Humbert and Lolita to lunch the following day, but Humbert plans to be gone with Lolita by then. Humbert returns to the hotel room to find Lolita half awake. He climbs into bed with her, but doesn't make any advances. Anxious and excited, Humbert stays awake all night. In the morning, Lolita wakes up and nuzzles him as he feigns sleep. She asks him if he ever had sex as a youth. When Humbert says no, Lolita has sex with him. Humbert states that, for her, sex was just another activity between children, unconnected to what adults do behind closed doors. Humbert launches into a dreamy description of how he would repaint the Enchanted Hunters Hotel in order to make the setting of his first encounter with Lolita a more natural, romantic one. Humbert once again defends his actions as natural, using history as evidence. He notes that according to an old magazine in the prison library, a girl from the more temperate climates of America becomes mature in her 12th year. He further reminds the reader, whom he calls his jury, that he wasn't even Lolita's first lover. Lolita recounts her first sexual experiences. Astonished by Humbert's naivete, she tells him that many of her friends have already experimented sexually with one another. At summer camp, she used to stand guard while her friend Barbara and Charlie, the camp mistress's son, copulated in the bushes. Soon, Lolita's curiosity led her to have sex with Charlie as well, and she and Barbara began taking turns with the boy. Lolita says it was fun, but expresses contempt for Charlie's manners and intelligence. Humbert gives Lolita the various presents he bought for her, and they prepare to leave the hotel. He warns Lolita not to talk to strangers. He later notices a man, about his age, staring at Lolita while she reads a movie magazine in an armchair. Humbert thinks the man resembles his Swiss uncle Gustav. Humbert becomes upset by Lolita's shifting moods and her seeming disinterest in him, and he worries about how to keep their new arrangement a secret. As they drive off, he tries to uncover what Lolita's friends know about her sexuality, but Lolita is in a bad mood and irritated by Humbert's touches. Humbert feels guilty, but still desires her, and she remains confused and unhappy. Even as he tries to cheer her up, Lolita says that she was only an innocent girl and that she should tell the police that Humbert raped her. Humbert can't tell if she's joking or not. Lolita complains of pains and accuses Humbert of tearing something inside her. Lolita becomes angry and upset and demands to call her mother. Humbert tells her that her mother is dead. Humbert buys Lolita many things in the town of Leppingville. In the hotel, they have separate rooms, and he can hear Lolita crying. Sometime in the night, she creeps into his bed because, as Humbert says, she has nowhere else to go. Humbert and Lolita begin their travels across the United States, and Humbert describes in detail the many typically American motels and hotels they stay in. Describing Lolita as a child driven by whims, Humbert indulges most of her fancies, except when she wants to mingle with other tourists. He occasionally allows her to mix with other girls her own age, but he restricts her access to boys. Humbert realizes that he must secure Lolita's cooperation in order to continue in this fashion and to keep her from complaining too much. He emphasizes to Lolita that she has no one else but him. If she accuses him of rape, she'll end up at a state-run reformatory school. Humbert continues to distract her with new destinations and new gifts. Over the course of a year, they travel all over the country, ending up in the northeastern town of Beardsley, Lolita's birthplace. Humbert states that their tour did not do America justice. Rather, they wandered from tourist spot to tourist spot simply in order to keep Lolita tolerably amused. Lolita is always eager to pick up hitchhikers, and Humbert realizes that their continual sexual activity has given Lolita an air that attracts other men and boys. He tries to prevent her from seeing other boys, but Lolita likes to flirt. Humbert enjoys watching other female children play, but Lolita would rather ride horseback or play tennis. Once, during a match, Humbert believes that he sees a man holding a racket and talking to Lolita. Humbert claims that he tried everything to show Lolita a good time, but admits that he was mainly concerned with keeping the affair secret and keeping Lolita happy enough to have sex with him. He states that he is very happy, but Lolita constantly hurts him with her indifference and her desire to meet other people. Humbert attempts to relive his experience with Annabelle by taking Lolita to the beach. He fails to recreate the past and consoles himself by having sex with Lolita in beautiful outdoor locations. They make love by the mountains and get caught by a woman and her children, barely managing to escape. Humbert and Lolita see many popular movies, and at one two women catch him fondling Lolita in the movie theater. Once again, Humbert just escapes without incident. Even when they occasionally encounter policemen, Lolita does not reveal their arrangement. Anxious about the legality of the situation, not to mention dwindling funds, Humbert decides to settle in Beardsley and teach at the Beardsley Women's College, while sending Lolita to the sedate girls' school. Humbert realizes that despite their wide travels, they have really seen nothing, and he believes their trip has somehow defiled a great country. He also knows that Lolita cries every night, while he pretends to sleep. With the help of Humbert's acquaintance Gaston Godin, Humbert and Lolita move to 14 Thayer Street, an unimpressive house in Beardsley. Humbert is disappointed in the Beardsley School for Girls, which emphasizes social skills rather than intellectual achievement. The headmistress, Pratt, believes that Beardsley girls must focus on the 4 Ds: dramatics, dance, debating, and dating. Humbert is appalled, but some teachers reassure him that the girls do some good, solid schoolwork. The Thayer Street house has a view of the school playground, which pleases Humbert, since he believes he will be able to watch Lolita and, he hopes, other nymphettes. Unfortunately, builders arrive to make changes and block his view. Humbert describes Beardsley and his neighbors, with whom he is on civil yet distant terms. He constantly worries that they might snoop on his arrangement. Humbert also worries that Lolita might confide in their cook, Mrs. Holligan, and tries to make sure that they are never left alone together. Humbert's friendship with Gaston Godin, a popular man regarded as a French sophisticate and genius scholar, smooths his arrival in the new town of Beardsley. Gaston knows all of the small boys in the neighborhood and has portraits of them, as well as famous artists, in his home. Humbert enjoys their occasional chess games, but finds Gaston to be a mediocre scholar and somewhat dim-witted. Humbert and Lolita's relationship has become more strained. Despite her allowance and many small presents, Lolita wants more money, and she starts to demand it before performing sexual favors. Humbert periodically breaks into her room to steal back her savings so she cannot run away from him. Humbert worries about Lolita attracting boys, and he reads the local paper's teen advice column for instruction. He allows Lolita to interact with some boys in groups, but never alone, a rule that upsets Lolita. Despite his attempt to control every aspect of Lolita's life, Humbert can't be sure that she hasn't stolen away with a boy. However, he has no particular boy to suspect. Humbert imagines how others see him and wonders how he has managed to fool everyone. He still lives in a constant state of anxiety. Humbert finds himself disappointed by Lolita's friends, few of whom are nymphets. He talks to Lolita's friend Mona to discover if Lolita has any boyfriends, but Mona, rather than supplying Humbert with details, seems attracted to him instead. In a brief aside, Humbert describes how, sometimes, he would crawl over to Lolita's desk while she was doing her homework and beg for some affection. Each time, Lolita rebuffs him. One day, Pratt informs Humbert that Lolita isn't maturing sexually and exhibits disciplinary problems. Pratt's psychological analysis bothers Humbert, as do the evaluations given by Lolita's teachers. Pratt ends by asking Humbert if Lolita knows about sex, and she tells him that Lolita should start dating boys and, furthermore, that she should be allowed to take part in the school play. Pratt goes on to say that Lolita has an alarming vocabulary of curse words. After his appointment with Pratt, Humbert goes to see Lolita in the study room, where Lolita and another girl are reading quietly. Sitting beside Lolita, and behind the other girl, Humbert pays Lolita 65 cents to masturbate him. After Lolita recovers from an illness, Humbert allows her to throw a small party with boys. The party isn't a success, and the boys don't impress Lolita, which is such a relief for Humbert that he buys her a new tennis racket. For her birthday, he buys her a bicycle and a book of modern American paintings, and while he enjoys watching her ride the bike, he remains disappointed by her inability to appreciate fine art. Lolita begins rehearsing for a play entitled The Enchanted Hunters, in which she plays a farmer's daughter who bewitches a number of hunters. Humbert notes that the play has the same name as the hotel he and Lolita first stayed in, but he doesn't think much of it. He also doesn't mention the coincidence to Lolita, for fear that she'll mock him and his nostalgia. At the time, Humbert assumes the play is nothing more than a trifling work written specifically for schoolchildren. He tells the reader that he now knows the play to be a recent composition, written by a noted playwright. Humbert scoffs at the play's overt romanticism and fantasy. One day, as Lolita rides her bike, she teasingly asks Humbert if the Enchanted Hunters was, in fact, the name of the hotel where he first raped her. Some days later, Humbert becomes outraged when he gets a call from Lolita's piano teacher, who tells him that Lolita has been missing her lessons. When confronted, Lolita claims she has been rehearsing for the play in a local park. Lolita's friend Mona corroborates the story, but Humbert assumes both girls are lying. While Humbert and Lolita discuss the issue heatedly, he realizes that she's changed and possesses fewer nymphet qualities. Humbert panics and threatens to take her away from Beardsley if she continues lying. Lolita becomes furious, and they have a loud, angry fight in which she accuses him of violating her and murdering her mother. Humbert grabs her by the wrist and attempts to restrain her. Just then, a neighbor calls to complain about the noise, and as Humbert apologizes, Lolita escapes from the house. Humbert drives around looking for her and finally finds her in a telephone booth. Lolita tells Humbert that she hates the school and the play and wants to leave Beardsley, but only if they go where she wants to go. Relieved, Humbert agrees to her demands. At home, Lolita tells Humbert to carry her upstairs, as she's feeling romantic. Humbert confesses that this brought him to tears. Humbert tells the school that he's been hired as a consultant for a movie in Hollywood, but promises to return. Excited to be traveling again, Lolita plans out where they'll go and where they'll stay. As they're driving away from the town, Medusa Gold, the acting coach, pulls up alongside them in her car. She says it's a shame Lolita couldn't finish the play since the playwright himself was so taken with her. As Medusa drives off, Humbert asks Lolita who wrote the play. Lolita tells him it was some old woman, Claire something. With that, Humbert and Lolita start their travels. Humbert and Lolita stay in a succession of hotels. Humbert keeps a very close watch on Lolita to keep her from communicating with anyone he doesn't know. However, Lolita occasionally manages to disappear, even under Humbert's watchful eye. She changes her mind often about their destinations, sometimes wanting to stay on for no apparent reason. One day, Humbert goes out but suddenly feels nervous, and he returns to the hotel room to find Lolita completely dressed. Humbert's suspicions, while still vague, grow stronger. Humbert secretly keeps a gun that belonged to Lolita's father and stands guard with it at night. He reminds the reader that, in Freudian analysis, a gun represents the father's phallus. As they continue heading west, Humbert becomes increasingly paranoid. One day, Humbert catches Lolita talking to a strange man, who resembles Humbert's relative Gustav Trapp. Lolita says she was simply giving him directions, and shrugs off Humbert's suspicions. On the road the next day, Humbert suspects they're being followed by a red car, but manages to evade it. Lolita says she has misread the tour book, and by mistake they find themselves at a theater, watching a play written by Claire Quilty and Vivian Darkbloom. Humbert is suspicious about the play's authors, but cannot see them well in the shadows. When questioned, Lolita states that Vivian is actually a man and Claire is the female author of The Enchanted Hunters. Humbert recalls that Lolita used to have a crush on the celebrity Claire Quilty, but Lolita laughs off the idea. At the post office, Humbert reads a letter to Lolita from Mona, who describes the school production of The Enchanted Hunters. When he finishes the letter, he realizes that Lolita has disappeared. Humbert chases after her, and when he finds her, Lolita says she had seen one of her friends from Beardsley. Humbert interrogates her vigorously, but she does not budge in her story. Humbert tells Lolita that he has written down the license plate number of the car following them, but he discovers that Lolita has erased the number and smacks her for it. Later, Humbert realizes that the man following him, whom he has taken to calling Trapp, after Humbert's Swiss relative, whom the man resembles, has been switching cars. When Humbert's car gets a flat tire, Trapp stops not far behind them. Humbert gets out of the car to confront him, but Trapp turns and speeds away while Humbert's car, with Lolita at the wheel, starts moving. Lolita claims that she was trying to stop the car from rolling away. Humbert begins to keep the gun in his pocket. Despite believing that Lolita's acting experience has taught her to be deceitful, Humbert fondly remembers watching her go through her drama exercises. However, that thrill doesn't compare to the joy he feels while watching Lolita play tennis. Humbert goes on at length, describing how maddeningly attractive Lolita is on the tennis courts. He admits that he finds all kinds of games romantic and magical, including his chess games with Gaston. In the middle of one tennis game at a hotel in Colorado, Humbert receives an urgent note that the Beardsley School has called. However, Humbert realizes that the school would have no way of getting in touch with him there. From a window in the hotel, Humbert looks back to the tennis court and sees a strange man playing doubles with Lolita. By the time Humbert returns, the man has left and neither Lolita nor the other doubles pair will tell him about the mysterious stranger. Lolita tells him she wants to go swimming. Later, at the pool, Humbert sees a dark-haired man watching Lolita lasciviously. He sees that Lolita can tell the man is watching her, and he watches as Lolita flirts with the man from afar. Humbert recognizes him as Trap, the man who has been following them, but Trap disappears before Humbert can confront him. Humbert drinks heavily and starts to wonder if he's imagining Trap. Later that night, Lolita claims to be ill. Seeing that she has a high fever, Humbert takes her to the hospital. He stays in a nearby motel, separated from Lolita for the first time in 2 years. Lolita recovers quickly, and Humbert visits her in the hospital, bringing presents. He sees a letter on Lolita's bed tray, but the nurse insists that it belongs to her, not Lolita. Later, Humbert himself becomes feverish, but he tells the hospital he'll pick up Lolita the following day. However, when he arrives at the hospital, the doctors inform him that Lolita has already left with her uncle. Humbert goes into a violent rage, but manages to get himself out of the hospital. He vows to kill Lolita's abductor. Humbert retraces the tour he and Lolita took across the country, attempting to find some clues as to Lolita's whereabouts. As he revisits the 342 hotels and motels they stayed at, he learns that Lolita's abductor had been following them for some time. The abductor has signed into various hotel registers with a series of sophisticated, wittily elusive fake names. Humbert deduces that Lolita and the kidnapper have been in touch since the beginning of their road trip. Upon returning to Beardsley, Humbert plans to accost an art professor at Beardsley College, who once taught a class at Lolita's school. As he sits outside the professor's classroom with the gun in his pocket, Humbert realizes that his suspicions have made him paranoid. Humbert hires a detective, who proves to be useless. He imagines he sees Lolita everywhere and tries rid himself of her possessions. He writes a missing persons ad in verse. Humbert psychoanalyzes his own poem, but does not post it. In his loneliness, Humbert begins a relationship with Rita, a woman in her late 20s with a checkered history. Humbert finds her ignorant but comforting, and their relationship lasts for 2 years. During this time, Humbert gives up his search for Lolita's abductor and spends his time wandering with Rita, drinking heavily. Nonetheless, he finds himself returning to the old hotels to relive memories of Lolita. He cannot, however, bring himself to go to the Enchanted Hunters Hotel. Meanwhile, Rita grows increasingly unstable and becomes convinced that Humbert will leave her. Gradually, Rita and Humbert begin to live apart, though Humbert visits her frequently. During one visit, Humbert discovers that 2 letters have been forwarded to him. The first is from John Farlow, who remarried after Jean died of cancer. John states that he has handed over the complicated case of the Hayes estate to an attorney named Jack Windmuller. The second letter is from Lolita. Addressing Humbert as Dad, she writes that she has become Mrs. Richard F. Schiller and is currently pregnant. She writes asking for money, but withholds her home address in case Humbert is still angry. After reading the letter, Humbert goes in search of Lolita and her new husband. Taking the gun along with him, Humbert plans to kill Lolita's husband, whom he assumes is the same man who abducted Lolita from the hospital. Though Lolita didn't give her specific address, Humbert manages to find the town she lives in, Colmont. Nervous and agitated, Humbert bathes and dresses in his finest clothes before inquiring after the Schillers. Humbert finally tracks Lolita down to a small, clapboard house on Hunter Road. Lolita has grown taller and wears glasses now, and is hugely pregnant. Though she has matured past the nymphette stage, Humbert realizes he still loves her deeply. Humbert sees Lolita's husband, Dick, a simple working man, outside in the yard. Lolita tells Humbert that Dick knows nothing about their past sexual relationship. Humbert realizes that Dick didn't abduct Lolita from the hospital, and Lolita, wanting Humbert's financial help, confesses that the man who took her was the playwright Claire Quilty. Lolita describes Quilty as the great love of her life. She tells Humbert that Quilty knew Charlotte and had come to Ramsdale many times to visit his uncle, Ivor Quilty, the dentist. Dick comes inside the house, and Lolita introduces Humbert as her father. Humbert realizes that he bears the man no ill will. When Dick returns outside, Lolita continues her story. After she ran away with Quilty, she lived on his ranch with his friends, all of whom engaged in strange sexual practices. Lolita refused to participate, claiming that she only loved Quilty, and Quilty kicked her out. She found work as a waitress and eventually met Dick. Humbert realizes that he will love Lolita until he dies and begs her to come away with him. Lolita thinks Humbert might give her money if she goes to a motel with him, but Humbert says he'll give her the money regardless of her answer and hands her $4,000. Lolita is excited by the money, but firmly and gently refuses to go away with Humbert, saying she would rather go back to Quilty. Humbert leaves her with the money and drives off, weeping. Humbert departs to find Dr. Ivor Quilty. Attempting to take a shortcut, Humbert's car gets hopelessly stuck in a muddy ditch. He walks several miles, in the rain, to a farmhouse and waits for someone to pull his car out. Around midnight, he manages to drive on, but exhaustion causes him to stop in a small town, not far from the Enchanted Hunter's Hotel. Humbert remembers a priest he once knew in Quebec, who would discuss the nature of sin with him at length. He confesses that, despite receiving much spiritual solace from the priest, he himself can never forget the sinful things he inflicted on Lolita. He claims that he will never find peace because, as he puts it, a maniac deprived Dolores Hayes of her childhood. Humbert realizes that because he was so consumed by his desire for her, he never really understood the real Lolita. In his narrative, he begins addressing Lolita directly. Humbert recalls a time, back in Beardsley, when Lolita burst into tears after witnessing the ordinary, normal affection between her friend and her friend's father. Humbert realizes that even her strained relationship with Charlotte was preferable to Lolita's life with him and that Lolita must miss her mother. Humbert returns to Ramsdale. He visits the old Hayes house, now occupied by a new family with an infant daughter. Humbert visits Windmuller's office, then goes to see Dr. Ivor Quilty on the pretext of needing some dental work. From Ivor, Humbert learns that Claire Quilty lives in Paver Manor, on Grim Road. With that knowledge, he leaves Dr. Quilty abruptly. Humbert drives past Paver Manor and imagines what kind of scandalous, reprehensible activities must be taking place inside. He drives back into town, to return the next morning. Through the trees, he sees the screen of a drive-in movie. Humbert can see a man in the film raise a gun before the trees obscure his vision. The next day, Humbert arrives at Paver Manor with his loaded gun. Humbert enters the huge and extravagantly furnished house and hunts for Quilty. Quilty emerges from a bathroom and appears unmoved by Humbert's requests that he recall Lolita. While Humbert explains to Quilty why he must die, Quilty tries to distract him with clever wordplay. Quilty lunges for the gun, and the two men wrestle. Humbert regains control of the gun, then reads a poem detailing Quilty's crimes. Quilty critiques the poem and offers Humbert many bribes, including concubines and erotic pictures. Humbert shoots, and Quilty tries to escape, running through the house. Humbert shoots him many times, but Quilty does not seem to die. Quilty begs for his life, but Humbert finally kills him. Humbert realizes that he does not feel any peace and is surprised to see a group of people sitting in the drawing room downstairs, drinking. Humbert claims he killed Quilty, but no one notices. Humbert then drives off and, out of sheer rebellion, speeds down the wrong side of the road. He gets arrested after running a red light and driving into a meadow. Humbert realizes that the real tragedy is not that he has lost Lolita, but that Lolita has been robbed of her childhood. From jail, Humbert writes that he opposes capital punishment but would sentence himself to 35 years for rape and dismiss the rest of the charges. He addresses the last section to Lolita, telling her to be true to her husband Dick and advising her not to talk to strangers. He also asks her not to mourn Quilty, as he felt that killing Quilty was a public service. He also states that, if given a choice between Quilty and Humbert, Humbert should live, so he might chronicle this story and immortalize Lolita through his art.